The city of London stirred before the sun, a quiet, grey breath rising from chimneys that coughed smoke into a sky already worn from yesterday's soot. The year was 1847, and in the narrowest lanes of Whitechapel 1,000 small footsteps pressed against cobblestones slick with rain and waste. The air tasted faintly of coal, cabbage, and the metallic sting of survival. Somewhere between the baker's shop and the butcher's window, a boy named Edwin pulled the collar of his father's coat tighter around his thin neck and stared at the hollow shelves that used to smell of bread. The baker had long since run out of flour, and the scraps he swept into his palms would soon become another family's breakfast. Edwin waited anyway, because waiting was free. All around him, carts rattled, horses groaned, and voices mumbled about the price of grain that had doubled again. The great famine in Ireland had spilled hunger into London's streets, and even those who had once eaten well were learning what it meant to crave air more than food. In tenements that leaned like tired old men, women boiled onion skins for broth and saved bacon grease in jars as if it were gold. Men carried shovels, not for work, but for hope, waiting at dockyards for someone, anyone, to knead their strength for a few coins. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was a shared crust of yesterday's bread dipped in weak tea that tasted of smoke. Children scraped porridge pots with spoons until the iron showed through, and the sound of that scraping was the morning song of the poor in this world. Food was not a comfort, but a measure of endurance. Every crumb meant another day of life. A single potato could feed 3 people if sliced thin and cooked slowly in a broth of nothing but water and salt. Some replaced flour with sawdust. Some brewed soup from bones found behind butchers' stalls. The city didn't judge. It was too busy surviving. The Thames carried its secrets downstream. Rotting vegetables from Covent Garden, spoiled fish from Billingsgate, and the whispers of those who had nothing left to eat. Across the river, in Mayfair, kitchens stirred awake too, but with different music. There, servants laid silver trays of eggs, sausages, toast, and marmalade on polished tables while their masters still slept. The smell of butter drifted out of cracked windows, floating above streets where men begged for crumbs. The contrast was almost cruel, but cruelty had long been part of breakfast. Edwin's mother once told him stories of mornings filled with warmth of bread fresh from the oven, the crust cracking beneath a knife, steam rising like ghosts of better days. She said hunger had a sound, a low hum inside the chest that whispered when the body began to eat itself. That sound was the anthem of London now. Even the church bells, when they rang, seemed to echo it. In the marketplaces, the poor gathered early, not to buy but to watch. They waited for closing hours, when vegetables bruised and unsold would be tossed aside. Then began the scramble, old men and mothers pushing against one another, clawing for carrots, split in half, or cabbages spotted with rot. It was not dignity they sought, only survival. Children learned early that hunger had no manners. You ate what you found, or you didn't wake the next day. The baker finally emerged, his apron dusted white like snow on a grave. He looked at Edwin and the others and said nothing. There was no bread to spare. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handful of crumbs, and scattered them into the gutter for the pigeons. The birds descended in a frenzy, wings flapping, beaks stabbing, feathers catching light like pieces of hope. Edwin watched, his stomach turning, and thought of catching one. Some boys did. They roasted pigeons over candle flames, the smoke filling the room with a smell both sweet and guilty. But today, he didn't have the courage. He turned away, the city spinning softly around him, and walked toward the docks, where men queued for labor. His mother's voice echoed in his head. If you find nothing, bring home the story instead. So he walked with empty hands, but his eyes gathered everything. The girl in rags, sipping rainwater from a tin cup. The old woman trading a pair of boots for half a loaf. The butcher sharpening his knife and pretending not to notice the hungry faces pressed to his glass. As the fog lifted, the day revealed its dull color, pale, tired, endless. The clatter of hooves mixed with the clinking of bottles as the milkman made his rounds, though few could afford his goods. He poured more milk into the gutter than into cups. The smell of it, warm, sweet, wasted, filled the air and made the hunger sharper. Edwin reached the docks and joined the silent crowd of men waiting for a foreman's nod. Some had been there since dawn. Others hadn't eaten since the week before. There was no anger among them, only that quiet, patient despair that becomes part of the bones. When work came, it was brief, and payment was often bread instead of coin. Bread was more valuable than money now. It didn't lie, didn't vanish, didn't get stolen by rent collectors. A loaf was life. By noon, the city was loud with movement. Chimneys smoked, children cried, church bells tolled. But beneath the noise, hunger remained a steady hum. Even the rats seemed thinner that year. In the workhouses, gruel was ladled with a precision that bordered on cruelty. 1 spoon per mouth, no more. Those who asked for seconds were punished, and yet people still came. Better to be fed insult than starve in pride. The smell of gruel flour boiled with water until it lost both taste and color filled the air. It was the smell of the era itself, bland, gray, and impossible to forget. As night approached, lamps flickered along the streets, turning the fog gold. Edwin returned home with a piece of stale bread someone had dropped at the docks. His mother smiled as if he had brought treasure. They shared it carefully, crumb by crumb, and afterward sat by the small fire, the last bit of coal burning like a dying heart. Outside, the city whispered in 1,000 hungry voices, all telling the same story. Hunger did not discriminate. It simply stayed, patient, invisible, eternal. And in that stillness, Edwin closed his eyes, his stomach quiet for a moment, his dreams filled not with riches or adventure, but with the image of warm bread and a full morning sun. London's afternoon had a color that never decided between light and shadow, a damp gray that soaked through bricks, bones, and belief alike. And by the time the bells struck 3, the city was wrapped in drizzle, so fine it seemed to whisper rather than fall, threading through chimney smoke and the faint cries of vendors calling out to empty streets. In one narrow room above a cobbler's shop in Spitalfields, Clara stirred water in a dented kettle and pretended it was tea. She did it every day at this hour because habit, even when hollow, could still taste like comfort. The fire beneath the pot was small, fed with scraps of wood pulled from the street, but it burned steady, and as the water began to murmur, she gathered her 2 children close. They sat cross-legged on the cold floor, their thin hands wrapped around chipped cups that once belonged to someone richer. and waited for the sound that meant warmth was coming. There were no tea leaves left. Those had been gone since winter. What she brewed now came from the banks of the Thames, dried nettles, a few dandelion roots, and sometimes a shaving of burnt bread to make the color darker. When she poured it, the steam rose soft and uncertain, carrying the scent of earth and smoke, nothing like the fragrant leaves from Ceylon or Assam that only the rich could afford. But Clara smiled anyway, because smiling made the children believe this was a real tea time, not an imitation of one. They lifted their cups as if holding treasure, sipped the bitter water, and sighed in unison. For a moment, they could almost forget that their stomachs had been empty since dawn. Across the city, in homes tiled with marble and filled with music, tea was being served on silver trays, golden spoons, stirring sugar into cups painted with roses, biscuits arranged like art beside porcelain saucers. Servants moved quietly behind their masters, careful not to make a sound louder than luxury, and the scent of Darjeeling drifted through velvet curtains into streets where no one could afford a loaf of bread. In those poorer streets, tea had become myth. What people called tea now was anything that colored water, roasted barley, caramelized sugar scraps, burnt crust, even old leaves scavenged from refuse piles behind great houses. There were entire markets that traded in used tea gathered from the bins of the wealthy, dried again in the sun, sold cheap in brown paper packets to those who couldn't tell the difference between bitterness and survival. Clara had once found such a packet at a stall near Whitechapel and treated it like gold, steeping it 6 times before it turned the water pale as memory. Each brew weaker than the last, each sip a little less of what it pretended to be. Yet still she brewed it because the act itself was a prayer. Tea, even fake tea, gave shape to the day. Without it, time would unravel into hunger and despair. When her husband, Thomas, returned from the tannery at dawn, his skin smelling of lime and leather, the first thing he always asked for was tea. He never questioned what was in the pot. He only needed the warmth, the illusion of care. She would pour it into his hands, and he would drink it slowly, closing his eyes as though it might erase the ache in his back or the hunger in his belly. That ritual, repeated endlessly, was what kept them alive, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. Outside, the city coughed and rumbled, a living beast made of soot and fog. The milkman's cart rattled down the lane, though few could pay him, and the smell of coal fires mixed with wet stone to create the scent of poverty itself, heavy, damp, and unshakable. Sometimes, Clara looked out of her small window and saw women across the street doing the same thing, pouring boiled rainwater into empty teapots, pretending together, performing a collective dream that one day they might taste sweetness again. Children played at tea parties too, with cups made of tin and spoons carved from wood, mimicking manners they had never learned, lifting pinkies as they sipped air. Imagination had become the city's richest ingredient. When the drizzle thickened into rain, Clara would pull her shawl tighter and watch the drops trail down the glass like slow tears. And she would think about her mother, who once brewed real tea every Sunday after church, served with milk and jam, when life had still been full of small certainties. Now those certainties had melted into routine and repetition work, hunger, sleep, and the fragile ceremony of pretending everything was still proper. Yet in that pretense lay a kind of defiance. To pour water into a pot and call it tea was to refuse despair, to say, we still exist. We still know gentleness. As evening came and lamps began to flicker in the fog, Clara poured the last of the hot water into her cup and held it between her palms, feeling the ghost of warmth spread through her fingers. Outside, carriage wheels splashed through puddles, and laughter drifted faintly from the tavern down the street. Her children had fallen asleep, curled up under patched blankets, their faces peaceful in the dim light. She took one final sip of her bitter brew, its taste sharp and thin, and whispered softly to herself, "It's tea," as if naming it made it true. The steam rose one last time and vanished into the dark, leaving behind only the echo of its warmth and the fragile dignity of those who made something out of nothing. Every single day, in a city that had forgotten how to notice them. Night in London did not fall, it crawled, slow and smoky, spreading its weight across rooftops until even the gas lamps looked tired of burning. The streets were slick with the day's rain and filth, a mixture of horse waste, spilled ale, and the crushed skins of fruit that had once been someone's meal. In the alleys behind markets and taverns, the city's poorest began their quiet work, the search for dinner. They moved like shadows, hunched figures in tattered coats and boots without soles, eyes scanning the gutters for anything that could be eaten or traded for bread. Among them was young Edwin again, the same boy who once waited for crumbs outside the baker's shop, now older by a few hard months, his bones sharper, his stomach emptier. The market at Covent Garden had just closed, and the air still smelled faintly of cabbage and apples, though most of what remained lay crushed underfoot or rotting in wooden crates. A woman with a torn shawl leaned over a barrel and pulled out a handful of wilted lettuce, shaking off the mud before wrapping it in a piece of newspaper. Nearby, two boys fought quietly over a broken loaf, their hands striking faster than their voices. Edwin didn't join them. He had learned that patience often fed better than desperation. He waited until the crowds thinned, then slipped between the stalls, his fingers tracing along the tables until he found a few onions, soft but still whole. He placed them gently into his pocket as though they were jewels. Every piece of food, no matter how spoiled, carried the weight of survival. Some called this scavenging, others called it theft. But in truth, it was neither. It was simply living in a city that had too many mouths and too little mercy. In those days, the gutters were a marketplace of their own. Butchers tossed bones, still slick with fat. Grocers discarded bruised apples. Bakers threw out stale bread, too hard to chew. To the rich, these were wastes. To the poor, they were dinner. Mothers soaked stale loaves overnight in water to soften them, creating something called pudding of the poor, flavored with nothing but memory. Men boiled marrow bones until the broth turned cloudy, then shared it with neighbors. Some families roasted potato peels collected from the trash of restaurants, eating them with fingers blackened by soot. The lucky ones found scraps of meat, not enough to fill, but enough to pretend. And yet, for all its misery, there was a strange sort of order to this nightly ritual. People waited their turn. They shared finds with those who had children. Even hunger, when old enough, learns its manners. Edwin carried his onions home through fog that wrapped the city in silver. The river was rising again, swollen with the day's filth, and the stench clung to the air like an unwashed truth. He passed a row of beggars, sitting shoulder to shoulder, their hands outstretched not for coins but for crumbs. One man gnawed on a fish head pulled from the dock, eyes closed, as if pretending it was something grand. Farther down, a woman crouched by the gutter, scooping water into a tin bowl and washing off the dirt from carrot tops she had salvaged from the trash. She smiled at Edwin as he passed and said softly, "Eat slow, boy. Make it last." Her voice was gentle, almost maternal, though her own cheeks were hollow. He nodded and walked on, her words staying with him long after he turned the corner at home. His mother waited by the small stove that had long since lost its door. The room was dim, smelling of smoke and damp wood, the kind of smell that never left even when the windows were open. When Edwin placed the onions on the table, her eyes glimmered, not with joy, but with relief. She peeled them carefully, saving every layer, and dropped them into a pot of water that had already been boiled twice that week. The sound of the sizzling onion was almost music. For seasoning, she added a pinch of salt borrowed from a neighbor and a crust of stale bread to thicken the soup. It wasn't much, but it was dinner, and when the steam rose, it filled the room with a fragile warmth that made them forget the cold outside. They ate slowly, each spoonful a victory, each swallow a quiet prayer that tomorrow might bring something more. Outside, the night deepened. The lamplighter moved down the street, his long pole lifting tiny flames into the dark, one by one, like stars returning to a forgotten sky. Rats scurried along the gutters, their bellies rounder than most of the people's, feasting on what humans left behind. The sound of horses faded as taverns closed, leaving only the distant hum of the Thames and the occasional cough of someone sleeping in the street. London, at that hour, belonged to the hungry, the ones who searched, the ones who scraped, the ones who still believed that tomorrow's garbage might hold a miracle. Edwin finished his soup and stared into the pot, tracing the last bits with his spoon, unwilling to let the taste go. His mother watched him quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the firelight reflecting in her tired eyes. "There'll be better days," she said, though her voice trembled. He nodded, not because he believed her, but because believing was the only thing left that didn't cost money. They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the city muffled by rain, and somewhere outside a church bell rang midnight. That bell meant nothing to the rich, but to the poor. It marked the end of hunger's longest hour, the moment when you stopped searching and simply accepted the emptiness. Edwin lay down on the floor beside the dying fire, his body warm from soup, his mind drifting toward dreams that always began the same way: a table full of food, bread that never ended, and a city where nobody had to eat from the gutter. But as sleep came, so did reality, soft and cruel, reminding him that the morning would start again with hunger, and that, in London, survival was not a gift but a job. And still, as the rain fell against the roof and the last embers sighed into darkness, there was a strange beauty in it all, in the resilience, the small kindnesses, the way people turned waste into meals and despair into endurance. The city, though merciless, was alive with those who refused to die quietly, who scavenged not only for food but for dignity. And perhaps that, more than anything, was what made them stronger than the ones who dined behind marble walls. They knew how to find hope in the gutter and still call it dinner, When the first horn of the morning factory blew through the smoke-soaked streets of Manchester, it didn't wake the workers, it simply reminded them that sleep had ended hours ago. The year was 1852, and the city pulsed like a living machine, its heart made of iron, its breath the black smoke that crawled from every chimney. Among the crowd of pale faces, hurrying through the fog, was a small girl named Martha, barely 10, her boots too large, and her fingers wrapped in cloth to hide the burns from yesterday's work. She carried a tin lunch pail, dented and rusted, and inside it, wrapped in a scrap of newspaper, was her meal: 2 slices of bread gone stiff overnight, and a single cold potato. That was all, but she guarded it like treasure as she walked past puddles reflecting the trembling glow of gaslight. The air inside the textile mill was thicker than the fog outside, humming with the sound of gears and belts, and 1,000 weary breaths blending into one dull rhythm. Children like Martha worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, their small bodies swallowed by machines taller than their dreams. They coughed black dust, their hair powdered with cotton, and their hands moved so fast that time forgot them. At midday, when the overseer blew his whistle, they were allowed 10 minutes to eat, 10 minutes to remember they were human. Martha sat on the cold floor, her back against the wall, and opened her pail as though she were unveiling a feast. Around her, other children did the same: a boy with half an apple, another with nothing but boiled water in a tin cup, and one who shared crumbs from yesterday's loaf as if dividing gold. They spoke little words, took energy, but their eyes met in quiet understanding, the kind that only hunger can teach. The bread in Martha's hand was dry, and when she bit it, it crumbled like dust, but she chewed slowly, savoring each grain as if it could keep her heart beating longer. The potato, once warm from the hearth, was now cold and soft, its skin wrinkled, but she ate it with care, using her fingertips to scrape every piece clean. There was no salt, no butter, no tea to wash it down, only the taste of iron from the air and soot from her lips. Yet in that moment she smiled, because she was not alone, and because having anything to chew was more mercy than most could hope for. Around her, the older workers smoked their pipes, their faces ghostly in the haze, while the overseer paced with a watch chain glinting at his vest, counting minutes like coins. When the whistle blew again, lunch was over, and the world turned mechanical once more. Martha rose, her limbs trembling, and returned to the machine, feeding threads through spindles so fast her fingers bled. She didn't notice the blood, it was the same color as the cotton dust that coated everything. As hours passed, her stomach tightened again, but she didn't stop. Stopping meant punishment. The windows of the mill were too high to see through, and even if she could, there was nothing outside but gray sky and the silhouettes of chimneys, bleeding smoke. Time blurred. By evening, her tin pail was empty, her hands raw, and her small shoulders bent like the arches of the looms she served. When the final bell rang, the workers poured out like ghosts escaping a furnace, coughing, limping, silent. Martha walked home through streets slick with factory runoff, her body aching but her mind already thinking of tomorrow's lunch: another potato, another crust, another day to stay alive. As she reached her door, she looked up at the night sky, barely visible through the haze, and wondered if stars still existed, or if they too had been smothered by smoke. She closed her eyes, clutching the empty tin against her chest, and whispered a small wish into the dark, not for riches or rest, but for the simple taste of something warm, something kind. The city gave no answer, only the soft hum of distant machinery, the lullaby of the industrial age. In the heart of old London, beyond the gaslit streets and the endless rhythm of horse hooves on cobblestones, where the air tasted of soot and sorrow, there stood a forgotten building known by few and pitied by none, St. Bartholomew's orphan home for the lost and unclaimed. The walls were tall and stern, streaked with rain stains that looked like tears the city had long stopped shedding, and the iron gate groaned like an old man whenever it swung. Inside, time did not move forward. It merely hovered, trapped in the heavy air that smelled of damp wool and boiled turnips. 50 children called this place home, though none remembered what the word truly meant. They were little ghosts wearing patched clothes and empty stares, drifting from dawn to dusk beneath the watchful eyes of the matron, Miss Grimble, a woman with iron in her spine and ice where a heart should have been. Her keys jingled at her waist like a warning bell, and every child flinched at their sound. Dinner, if one could call it that, was announced each night at precisely 7 o'clock by the clang of a ladle against a pot. The noise echoed through the bare halls and down the long corridor, summoning the children from their chores and corners. They filed in quietly, wooden spoons clutched in trembling hands, their shadows long and crooked in the flicker of gaslight. The smell that met them was thin and weary, the faint aroma of vegetables boiled too long, the kind that told you more about hunger than nourishment. The cook, a hunched old man named Wicks, stirred a pot that could have held plenty once, but now seemed nearly empty even before serving began. Its contents were a grayish liquid, flecked with floating bits of turnip, cabbage ribs, and a lonely sliver of fat that drifted aimlessly like a dream refusing to die. Each bowl received one ladleful, no more, no less measured by Miss Grimble's sharp eyes. The children shuffled to the long table and sat in silence, their thin bodies pressed against each other for warmth, their breaths visible in the cold air. Little Samuel, the smallest of them all, dipped his spoon and stirred his reflection away. His lips were cracked, his fingers raw from scrubbing floors, yet he smiled faintly before taking the first sip, pretending it was stew thick with beef and barley. Around him, the other children did the same, turning imagination into their only form of flavor. A few dared to whisper about the day's work, the coal cart that had tipped over, the rat found in the corner, the way the rain came in through the roof and made puddles under their beds. But when the matron's cane tapped once against the stone, all talk ended. Silence returned, deep and suffocating, broken only by the scraping of spoons. Every swallow was an act of patience. Every empty bowl was a quiet prayer that tomorrow might bring more. When one child's spoon slipped and clattered to the floor, the entire hall froze. Miss Grimble turned her gaze like a blade, and with one sharp nod, the boy was taken away by Wicks to the punishment cell, a cupboard no larger than a coffin. No one dared move until the sound of the lock clicked shut. The candle at the end of the table flickered, its wax dripping like time melting away, and the children returned to their ritual of eating nothing and pretending it was enough. When the meal ended, bowls were stacked, hands were washed in cold water, and the line of orphans climbed the narrow staircase to the dormitory above. The beds were iron frames with straw mattresses, so thin that every spring could be felt against bone. Blankets were shared between two, sometimes three, and the rain tapping on the ceiling made a lullaby no one could afford to ignore. Samuel lay awake long after the others had drifted into restless dreams. He watched the moonlight crawl across the ceiling, silver and faint, sneaking through a crack in the roof. His stomach twisted softly, not just from hunger, but from a longing too large for words, a wish to be remembered by someone, anyone. He whispered to the darkness, asking if his mother could still see him, if perhaps angels could bring him bread in his sleep, or at least a dream where he wasn't cold. The only reply was the distant toll of church bells from the richer quarter, 12 slow chimes marking the end of another day of poverty. Somewhere beyond those foggy streets, families gathered around glowing hearths, carving roast meat, pouring gravy, breaking bread still warm from the oven. The scent never reached here, but the thought of it did, cruelly vivid, like a story told just to tease. And yet, even in that silence, there was a flicker of defiance, a strange, fragile thing that refused to die. It lived in the way Samuel pulled his blanket tighter, in the way he whispered good night to the boy beside him, and in the way the children dreamed of mornings brighter than the last, because hope, in those dark corners of London, was the only thing that could fill an empty belly. As the final candle burned out, the orphanage sank into darkness once more, swallowed by fog, guarded by hunger, forgotten by the city that built it. And the children, half-starved but still breathing, drifted into sleep, one soft sigh at a time, as if the night itself was listening. While the orphans of St. Bartholomew's Home dreamed on empty stomachs beneath a leaking roof, the other side of London glowed golden under 1,000 chandeliers, where the smoke was perfumed with roasted pheasant instead of coal, and the streets shone with carriages that clattered not from need but from pride. At the corner of Grosvenor Square stood a mansion of pale stone and carved angels, belonging to Lord and Lady Winthrop, names spoken with reverence in drawing rooms and whispered with envy in the alleys beyond. Tonight, their house hummed like an orchestra, its windows bright, its halls alive with laughter and the chime of glass. Footmen in crisp livery lined the entrance, and the moment the great clock struck 8, guests began to arrive, men with gold chains and waxed mustaches, women wrapped in silk that shimmered like moonlight, every step echoing against marble floors polished so perfectly that you could see your own hunger reflected in them. In the dining room, the tables stretched almost endlessly, covered in linen white as snow, adorned with silver candelabras that threw trembling halos of light onto gleaming dishes. There were flowers to white roses from Kent, imported lilies from France, and their scent mingled with the richer aroma of food, so decadent that even the walls seemed to breathe it in. First came the soups, served in porcelain bowls rimmed with gold, turtle soup thick with sherry, then mulligatawny spiced with pepper and cloves, a fragrance that clung to the air like memory. Next arrived platters of roasted fowl, pheasants stuffed with chestnuts, ducks glazed with orange, and great roasted hares laid upon beds of herbs. The butler moved like a ghost between courses, silent but certain, pouring red wine that caught the light like blood. The guests spoke of the Queen, of the new railway line, of the weather in Paris, never of hunger, never of factories, never of the poor. At the far end of the table, Lord Winthrop carved a joint of beef so tender it parted beneath the knife like silk, while his wife dabbed her lips with lace and smiled at her reflection in a silver dish. Between them, a crystal bowl held oysters from Whitstable, each shell gleaming like treasure. The servants carried in puddings, next plum, treacle, and suet, steaming clouds that filled the air with warmth and sugar. A small boy in uniform, no older than 12, stood by the fire, waiting to fetch more plates. His name was Thomas, and though his body stood in that golden room, his thoughts drifted to the narrow street behind the servants' quarters, where his sister slept with nothing but a crust of bread. He watched the guests laugh, their bellies full, their fingers heavy with jewels, and for a moment he wondered what they would say if they saw how the other half lived, if they knew that only half a mile away children were gnawing on potato skins and praying for warmth. But such thoughts were forbidden in houses like this. He looked down, back straight, lips sealed, as another course was served: roasted lamb, surrounded by bright peas and golden carrots polished like gems. The guests applauded the cook's genius, as if he were an artist, which, in a way, he was. For in an age when food defined worth, he painted wealth with flavor. When the clock struck 9, dessert appeared like a final act, towering trifles, sugar sculptures of swans and crowns, and crystal bowls of fruit that had traveled across oceans, pineapples from the Caribbean, oranges from Spain, and grapes so plump they looked impossible. Lady Winthrop leaned back in her velvet chair, fanning herself as the orchestra in the adjoining parlor began to play. The guests rose slowly, their laughter blending with violins as they drifted toward the ballroom, leaving behind the scent of satisfaction and the remains of luxury half-touched. On the plates, scraps of meat still glistened, sauces still pooled, and crumbs of cake sparkled like gold dust. Thomas and the other servants moved in silence to clear the table, stacking silver, scraping leftovers into buckets. One of them whispered, "It's enough to feed 20." And Thomas nodded but said nothing. When the kitchen doors closed behind them, the glow of chandeliers dimmed, replaced by the dull orange flicker of the servant lamps. Down in the basement, the cook allowed each servant a few bites from what remained: a torn crust of bread, a spoonful of pudding, a sliver of roast too small to notice missing upstairs. Thomas took his share quietly, closing his eyes as he chewed, not because it was delicious, but because guilt and gratitude tasted the same to him now, later, when the guests danced beneath a ceiling painted with angels. He slipped out the back door into the misty night. The air outside was cold, and the scent of roasting meat still clung to his clothes. He walked quickly down the alley to where his sister waited near the lamp-post, a small figure in a ragged shawl, her face pale as candlelight. "Did you get anything?" she asked, voice trembling. Thomas nodded and opened his hand to reveal a single bread roll, still warm. She took it as though it were a diamond, tearing it in half and pressing the larger piece back into his hand. They ate in silence, standing beneath the gaslight, their breath mingling in the fog, the city roaring softly around them. Somewhere far away, church bells rang, the same sound the orphans had heard hours earlier, the same rhythm that seemed to beat across the hearts of all London, hunger and plenty, side by side. Thomas looked back toward the mansion, its windows still glowing gold, and thought how strange it was that one city could hold both heaven and hell within a single street. When his sister finished her half, she smiled faintly, and in that fragile smile lived all the hope that the rich would never understand. The night deepened, the fog thickened, and London, indifferent and eternal, swallowed them both, the feast above and the hunger below, into its endless, breathing dream. London woke each morning not to birdsong but to the rattle of cartwheels, the shout of traders, and the soft shuffle of bare feet on wet stone. And among those footsteps moved a man named Arthur Bell, who had once been a blacksmith's apprentice, but now lived beneath the arches of Holborn Viaduct, with nothing to his name but a torn coat, a tin mug, and the echo of better days that had long burned out like the last coal in a dying fire. The dawn mist curled through the streets like ghosts escaping the Thames, wrapping the city in a pale, cold breath that seeped into every bone, every alley, every dream. For most Londoners, breakfast was a comfort: toast, porridge, perhaps a boiled egg if fortune allowed. But for Arthur, breakfast was a hunt, not for food, but for luck. He rose with the fog, his body stiff, his hands cracked and blackened, his beard thick with soot and rain. His stomach growled softly, a reminder that hunger had become his oldest friend. He walked toward Covent Garden, where the market stalls were setting up, their owners too busy shouting prices to notice the silent figures who lingered at the edges, waiting for what might fall. The smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery, warm and cruel, wrapping around him like a memory of childhood mornings when his mother would hum softly as she sliced bread thick with butter, the golden light spilling through a window that no longer existed. Now, the same scent only reminded him of distance, of how far he'd fallen from warmth into this cold that never ended. He waited near a barrel where bakers tossed broken crusts, his eyes scanning every movement, his breath visible in the chill. When the first loaf was dropped, half-burned and unsellable, Arthur moved, quick as thought, scooping it up before the pigeons dared. He brushed off the soot, tore a piece, and chewed slowly, feeling the stale crust scrape against his tongue. But to him it was manna, holy and real. Around him, others gathered, men and women, some children, their faces hollow, their clothes damp with the city's tears. They shared the same silence, the same slow chewing, the same gratitude for crumbs that others wouldn't notice. A woman with tangled hair offered him half a potato she'd found near the butcher's stall, and he thanked her with a nod, because words cost energy that hunger couldn't afford. Together they sat on the curb, the fog rising around them like a curtain drawn to hide their shame from the waking city. The market noise grew louder, laughter, horses, clinking coins, the sounds of a world that had no room for them. A boy no older than 12 ran past holding an apple, chased by a vendor shouting curses. Arthur smiled faintly, not out of cruelty, but admiration. The boy had courage, and courage was rarer than food. As the sun climbed weakly above the rooftops, the beggars began their morning rituals. Some begged near church gates, others searched the gutters for anything that might resemble sustenance. Arthur made his way toward Fleet Street, where gentlemen read their newspapers over tea and spoke of empire and industry, unaware that the man sweeping their crumbs into his hand was part of that same empire, just the forgotten, invisible half. He found a quiet corner beside a bakery vent, where the air was warm and smelled faintly of sugar and yeast. He sat there, closing his eyes, pretending he was eating again, his imagination kinder than reality. Sometimes a kind lady would drop a coin into his cup. Sometimes nothing but rain filled it. But he stayed, because warmth was worth more than charity. By noon, his small breakfast had vanished from his stomach like smoke, and fatigue crept through his limbs. He watched people pass, clerks in bowler hats, maids carrying baskets, soldiers in bright coats, all moving fast, all with purpose. He wondered if anyone ever looked down long enough to see him, or if he had already turned into part of the pavement. When hunger bit again, he walked toward the Thames, where scavengers gathered near the water's edge, searching the trash from the markets above. There, among rotting vegetables and torn paper, he found another prize, a bruised apple, brown at the edges but sweet in the center. He ate it in 3 bites, each one slower than the last, as though savoring not the taste but the miracle of having it at all. The river beside him reflected the city's heart, dark, restless, full of motion and memory. He dipped his tin mug into the water, took a careful sip, and grimaced at the metallic taste. But he drank anyway. As afternoon turned to evening, the light dimmed into a soft gold that painted even the poorest faces with a kind of grace. Arthur wandered back through the streets, past taverns spilling laughter and smoke, past church steps where preachers spoke of salvation to men too tired to listen. He stopped near an alley where a cat slept on a pile of rags, and for a brief, fragile second he envied its peace. His belly still ached, but he smiled anyway, because he'd survived another morning, another battle fought quietly in the streets that never noticed him. When the church bells tolled 6, he returned to his archway, laid down his tin cup beside him, and pulled his coat tighter. The city above roared on, oblivious, as the fog rolled back in, hiding the poor from the polite. Arthur looked up once more, his eyes tracing the faint outline of the moon through the smog, and whispered softly, "Tomorrow may be bread." The wind carried his words away like smoke from a dying fire, scattering them across rooftops, across windows, across lives that would never hear them. And as the first stars fought their way through the gray sky, Arthur closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, not peaceful, but steady, a sleep shaped by hunger, held by the hum of London, watched only by the river and the fog that knew all secrets. The sound of clanging keys and iron doors echoed through the narrow halls of St. Giles Parish Workhouse, as the morning fog lifted from the cobblestones outside, and for those within it was not a sound of order, but of endurance, for here breakfast was not a meal, it was an event to survive. The year was 1848. And London's workhouses had become both refuge and prison for the desperate souls who could no longer afford life beyond their walls. Inside, the air smelled of boiled oats, wet stone, and disinfectant. It clung to the skin like sorrow. Rows of men, women, and children moved through the corridors in silence, their boots scraping the floor in rhythm with the dull thud of ladles striking iron pots. They were the broken threads of an empire that had no use for weakness widows, cripples, old laborers, and orphans who had grown too tired to beg. In the dining hall, long wooden tables stood like altars, each lined with tin bowls waiting to be filled. The overseer, a thin man with a face carved by rules and years, stood by the door with a pocket watch in one hand and a cane in the other, timing each scoop as if mercy were rationed by the minute. From a massive cauldron, the cook poured ladles of thin, gruel watery mix of oats, flour, and sometimes, if luck permitted, a drop of milk so small it felt like rumor. The line moved forward, heads bowed, hands trembling, until every bowl held its portion, a gray, steaming liquid that smelled faintly of metal and exhaustion. The children received smaller helpings than the men, though none dared to question it. Questioning in a workhouse meant punishment, and punishment meant hunger twice over. They sat in silence, as if prayer had been replaced by obedience. The rules forbade talking during meals. Charity, as the overseers called it, must not be mistaken for kindness. A woman coughed at the end of the table, her thin shoulders shaking, but she covered her mouth quickly, afraid the sound might offend someone. Beside her, an old man named Henry lifted his spoon with shaking hands, eyes clouded by age and memory. Once, he'd been a carpenter, building homes for others. Now, he lived in one where no one truly lived. He took a mouthful of gruel. It was lukewarm, lumpy, with a faint bitterness that came from unwashed pots, but he swallowed without complaint. To complain was to risk the whip or the street. Across from him, a little girl with pale hair and bare feet stared at her bowl as if waiting for something to change. When she finally took a sip, she smiled faintly. And the man couldn't help but smile too, for in that moment, her imagination turned water and oats into soup and comfort. The overseer's boots clicked as he walked between the rows, his shadow stretching long and sharp over the table. Occasionally, he tapped the cane to remind them of the rules. No speaking, no looking around, no wasting food. Waste. How ironic that word sounded in a place where want ruled everything. When the bowls were empty, the inmates rose as one and carried them to the scullery, where women scrubbed them clean with cold water that bit into their skin. The clang of metal on metal filled the air like a dirge. Outside, the workday would soon begin, breaking stones, picking oakum, scrubbing floors. Labors meant to humble the poor, to remind them that charity was not free. In return for shelter and food, they surrendered their names, their pride, their right to dream. Henry followed the others toward the yard, but as he passed the kitchen door, he caught a glimpse of the cook wiping his brow, and behind him, a small loaf of bread left untouched on the shelf. His stomach twisted, but he looked away. Stealing even a crumb meant days in the punishment cell, dark and damp as a tomb. Still, that loaf burned in his mind all through the morning, the thought of its crust, its smell, its softness. By noon, the workhouse bell rang again, summoning them back for the second meal of the day. It was nearly identical to the first gruel, thinner this time, served with a hunk of bread so hard it could bruise the gums. A few inmates dipped it into the bowl to soften it, turning the gray mixture into paste. Some had lost their teeth entirely, gnawing only on memory. The air grew heavy with the sound of chewing, swallowing, and quiet sighs. A mother of 3 who'd been brought here when her husband died of fever. Her youngest boy, barely 6, sat beside her, clutching his bread like treasure. "Eat slowly," she whispered, breaking the rule, her voice trembling as she looked around. The overseer's eyes met hers for a split second, and fear froze her lips. She pretended to cough, to hide the sound, and continued to feed the child tiny pieces. When he smiled, she almost cried. That smile, small as it was, reminded her that love still existed, even here, where humanity had been rationed. The boy licked his fingers clean when he was done, and she wiped his face with the edge of her sleeve. The meal ended, as it always did, with the overseer's final inspection, ensuring every crumb was consumed. Afterward, the hall emptied slowly, leaving behind only the smell of boiled grain and tired souls. That night, when the lamps flickered low, Henry lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling's cracks that resembled roads leading somewhere he'd never go again. From the women's ward came the faint sound of lullabies, mothers singing to children who dreamed of bread and sunlight. Rain began to fall, tapping gently against the barred windows, and through that soft rhythm, he thought he could almost hear the city breathing beyond these walls, free, indifferent, alive. He closed his eyes and let the rain speak for him, whispering through the dark that maybe tomorrow's gruel would be warmer, maybe the overseer's mood lighter, maybe something kind might still exist in this world that called mercy a burden. The workhouse slept uneasily, its walls sighing under the weight of the forgotten. And outside, the gaslights of London shimmered faintly through the mist, feeding on dreams the poor could no longer afford. Beneath the flickering gas lamps of Whitechapel, where the air smelled of soot, horse dung, and stale ale, the butcher's market came alive before dawn. Its cobbled streets, slick with blood and rainwater, its wooden stalls lined with carcasses that hung like silent witnesses to hunger and survival. The butchers shouted in rough, cheerful tones, their cleavers flashing as they sliced through meat, bone, and sinew, and the city's poor gathered in shadows, watching, waiting, hoping for what came after the scraps. When the wealthier customers were done choosing their cuts, when the day's trade began to slow, that was when the real crowd came, the invisible ones, the rag-pickers, widows, workhouse runaways, and barefoot children who hovered like ghosts at the edge of the stalls. Their eyes darted toward the chopping blocks where fat, gristle, and slivers of unwanted flesh fell into piles that glistened in the weak morning light. The butchers knew them. Of course, they pretended not to see, but occasionally, with a grunt or a look, they would toss a scrap into the gutter, and the waiting hands would rush forward. In that filthy water, where blood mixed with mud, fingers fought for fragments, nails clawed at the stone, and someone always came away bleeding. Still, no one left empty-handed, because even a bone could mean dinner. A cracked marrow bone, when boiled for hours, could turn water into broth, a feast by their measure. Among them was a woman named Ada Green, her face hidden beneath a torn shawl, her hands wrapped in rags. She'd once worked as a maid in a fine house near Kensington, before sickness took her husband and hunger took her pride. Now she came every morning to the butcher's row, carrying a dented tin pail that smelled of yesterday's stew and smoke. She moved quietly, eyes down, waiting until the butcher boys swept the floor and threw out the waste. Sometimes they sneered, calling her old bones, but she didn't mind. Names didn't hurt as much as hunger. That morning, the sky was heavy with mist, and the streets echoed with the clatter of carts and crows. The butcher's apprentice, a red-faced boy of 16, dumped a bucket of offcuts into the gutter cartilage, fat. A few scraps of organ meat, and Ada lunged forward before anyone else could. Her fingers closed around something slippery, soft, and still warm. She didn't look at it too closely. She dropped it into her pail and backed away, heart pounding, eyes scanning the crowd for the constable. Taking from the gutter wasn't a crime on paper, but poverty itself was treated like one. She returned to her corner under the bridge, where a few other women huddled around a small fire built from broken crates. The Thames, wide and black beneath them, whispered against the stone, carrying with it the city's secrets, the smoke of factories, the ashes of dreams. Ada poured water from a rusty kettle into a tin pot, added her find, and waited for the bubbles to rise. The smell that drifted up was strange, metallic, almost unbearable, but it meant warmth, and warmth meant life. The others watched silently, each lost in thought. One of them, a girl no older than 15, clutched a baby to her chest, its face wrapped in a shawl that once might have been white. The child whimpered, and Ada reached out, tearing off a strip of boiled fat and handing it to the mother. "Let it chew," she said softly. "It'll keep quiet." The girl nodded, eyes glistening in the firelight. Around them, the city roared a symphony of wheels, hooves, and human struggle, but beneath the bridge there was only the sound of simmering broth and shallow breathing. By midday, the pot was nearly empty, and Ada leaned back, eyes half closed, feeling the faint warmth spread through her belly. For a moment, she imagined herself back in her mistress's kitchen, stirring soup in a fine copper pot, while laughter filled the house. But that dream dissolved as quickly as the steam. Hunger didn't allow nostalgia, only left space for survival. She stood, gathered her things, and walked back toward the market, where the smell of fresh blood hit her again like a memory of life itself. The butchers were packing up now, wiping their knives, scraping the boards clean. Dogs prowled between their legs, tongues lapping at the puddles. Ada knelt near one of the stalls where an old man was tossing trimmings into a barrel. "Anything left?" she asked. He looked at her, sighed, and handed her a paper-wrapped bundle, bones mostly, and a few scraps of suet. "Boil it twice," he muttered, "and throw away the first water." She nodded, murmured a thank you that sounded more like a prayer, and hurried off. That evening, as the city lights flickered across the fog, Ada found herself joined by two orphan boys at her fire. They were thin, with faces smudged by soot, but their eyes were bright with a wild kind of life. "What's in the pot, miss?" one of them asked. She smiled faintly. "Feast for kings," she said. The boys laughed, a sound too big for their bodies, and crouched beside her. When she served them the broth, they gulped it down greedily, the steam fogging their faces. "Tastes like heaven," the younger one said, licking his fingers. Ada chuckled softly, though she knew it tasted like nothing more than salt and smoke. Still, she watched them eat, and in that moment she felt something warm, not from the fire, but from within. It wasn't satisfaction, not quite. It was purpose. Feeding someone else, even with nothing, made her feel human again. As night deepened, the wind picked up, carrying with it the low toll of church bells from St. Mary's, signaling the end of another day. Ada wrapped her shawl tighter, staring into the flames until her eyes blurred. Around her, the others were already drifting into sleep, their heads resting on sacks, their bodies curled like question marks against the cold. She stayed awake, listening to the river, to the city's breathing, to the echo of laughter that belonged to someone she once was. Tomorrow she would return to the butcher's row, and the cycle would begin again, the waiting, the watching, the grabbing of scraps before the dogs did. It was a cruel rhythm, but it was hers. She'd learned long ago that in London you didn't live off the meat, you lived off what was left behind. Above her, the moon broke through the fog for just a moment, casting pale light over the street where carriages rattled by, carrying the well-fed home from their banquets. The contrast was almost beautiful in its cruelty, the rich, bloated with wine and roast, sleeping soundly in feather beds, while the poor dreamed of bones. Ada smiled faintly to herself, whispered something only the river could hear, and closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw a taboular, real one, heavy oak, set with silver spoons and bread still warm from the oven, and, for a heartbeat, she believed she was there. Then the fire crackled, the wind howled, and the dream faded, leaving only the steady pulse of survival in the heart of a woman who refused to die quietly. In the damp veins of London, beneath the grand boulevards, where the wealthy dined on roasts and puddings, lay a hidden world stitched together by hunger and hope, a city beneath the city, where the poor made kitchens out of shadows. It was a world built on whispers, where the smell of smoke was both invitation and warning, and where every meal was cooked in fear of discovery. For those who could not afford the rent of a room, there were the cellars low, dark caverns beneath crumbling houses, where families huddled around tin stoves, salvaged from the rubbish heaps of the rich. Their walls wept moisture, their ceilings sagged, and yet these were the places where life was stubborn enough to keep breathing. When night fell, and the constable's boots faded down the alleys, the city transformed. Beneath the soft hum of fog, hidden doors opened. Women slipped out with cracked pots and bundles of coal wrapped in cloth. They gathered near the old bridges, under staircases, behind abandoned breweries unwhere a small fire could burn unseen. The flames were low, their light trembling like a secret. Smoke drifted upward, mingling with the cold mist, while the sound of boiling water echoed softly against the brick. One could walk through the narrow streets of Clerkenwell or Spitalfields at midnight and never know that behind the shutters the poor were feasting in their own way. A tin bowl of potato peelings, a few beans, a spoonful of drippings, these were their banquets. A young woman named Martha, whose husband had died in a mill accident, ran one such kitchen from the corner of a basement that once belonged to a cobbler. Every evening she lit a stub of candle and stirred whatever she had managed to gather, a handful of oats from the market floor, a sliver of onion, a pinch of salt stolen from a workhouse store. She called it poor stew, and though it was thin as water, it drew people in. One by one, neighbors came to her door, clutching cups and broken bowls, trading bits of bread or coal for a share. No one went away hungry, though no one ever felt full. There was a quiet dignity in a tidy kind of rebellion against the city that had forgotten them. As Martha stirred, her face glowed in the candlelight, and the steam wrapped around her like a halo of survival. Children dozed by the wall, their faces smeared with soot but peaceful, the sound of the simmering pot becoming a lullaby that promised another dawn. Sometimes, the smell of these secret meals drifted up through the floorboards, catching the noses of landlords or police, and then came the pounding on doors, the shouts, the threat of eviction or arrest. It was illegal to light fires in certain districts, and many of the poor paid for their warmth with their freedom, but they kept cooking, for hunger knew no law. In the alleys of Limehouse, a man named Joseph ran a different kind of kitchen. His was a barrel cut in half, fitted with a grate and hidden behind stacks of old timber. There he roasted bits of horsemeat scavenged from knackers' yards, turning them over with a bent fork. The smell was sharp and heavy, but to those who waited nearby with trembling hands, it was divine. "You'll eat, or you'll die," Joseph often said, though he smiled when he said it. Once a sailor, now a scavenger, he fed not only himself, but the stray cats that haunted the docks. When asked why, he said, "They're hungry too, same as us." The cats purred around his feet as he worked, and sometimes he'd share his last bite with them. Farther west, near the soot-blackened chimneys of Paddington, lived a family of 7 in a single damp room, where the mother cooked meals on a small iron pan placed directly on the coals of their fireplace. The air inside was thick with smoke, the walls stained black, and the youngest child coughed in his sleep from the fumes. Yet when she stirred her pot, half cabbage, half rainwater shay hummed softly, the same lullaby her mother once sang in the countryside before they'd come to London in search of a better life. She remembered fields, birds, and fresh bread. Now her world was walls and ash, but the act of cooking still made her feel human. Each stir of the spoon was defiance, each meal a declaration. We are still here. Sometimes she would pretend the cabbage soup was stew and the stale bread was cake, and for the briefest moment her children believed her in the hidden corners of the city. Firelight danced on faces that had long forgotten joy, and yet there it was, small, flickering, alive. An old man named Thomas, who lived under the railway arch, built his kitchen out of bricks stolen from a collapsed wall. His stove was nothing more than a hole lined with stones, his pan an old helmet from the war. He boiled whatever the day offered, a pigeon caught near the docks, a handful of nettles, sometimes even candle wax, melted into soup for the sake of warmth. When others laughed at his madness, he'd grin through his missing teeth and say, "Better a fool with a hot meal than a wise man with an empty belly." His laughter echoed through the arches, mingling with the rattle of trains, above strange music of endurance. Sometimes, travelers from the countryside would wander into London and stumble upon these scenes, thinking they had discovered some pagan ritual fires glowing under bridges, faces gathered in circles, the air thick with strange smells. But these were no rituals. They were prayers made with pots and spoons. The poor didn't ask for miracles, they made their own. Each kitchen was a rebellion, a heartbeat of warmth in a city that thrived on coldness. The authorities could chase them, fine them, lock them up, but they couldn't extinguish the instinct to cook, to share, to survive. For in every pot that simmered in secret, there was more than just food. There was memory, community, and the faint echo of dignity. By dawn, the fires went out, and the smoke vanished into the fog, leaving no trace that life had been fought for there. Martha would scrape her pot clean and tuck it under her bed. Joseph would scatter ashes over his coals, and Thomas would curl up beside his dying embers. The streets would come alive again with the sound of carriages and vendors, and the city would look the same grand, indifferent, polished on the surface. But beneath it, in the cracks and corners, the secret kitchens of the poor would wait for night to fall again, ready to light their small fires against the great darkness. In the heart of Victorian London, where fog rolled through alleys like tired ghosts and hunger was more common than kindness. The women of the streets became the city's quiet providers. They were not cooks by trade, nor saints by choice. As the city's grand carriages clattered home from the opera and the gas lamps flickered awake, a different world stirred to life in the narrow lanes of Eastcheap, Holborn, and Spitalfields. There, women set up makeshift stalls and steaming pots, selling food to the poorest souls who roamed after dusk. They called them hot pie ladies, penny pudding women, and tea mothers. Their voices floated through the fog, calling softly, hot eels, warm pies, steaming broth, and in those cries there was both despair and hope. They stood wrapped in shawls, faces red from the cold, fingers cracked from years of work, their breath turning to mist as they ladled soup into tin cups for anyone who could spare a coin or a story. Some cooked from memory, some from mercy, and some simply because cooking was the only way to stay alive. The air around them smelled of pepper, boiled potatoes, and coal smoke, mingling with the scent of wet cobblestones and horse sweat. It was a strange perfume of survival that belonged only to London's forgotten women. One of them was Eliza Morton, a widow who had once been a seamstress before her eyesight dimmed. Each night she set up her small kettle stall near the steps of St. Paul's, where the cold wind from the Thames cut like knives. Her kettle was black with soot, her apron patched with flour, and yet when she poured tea into chipped cups, she did it with the grace of a lady serving porcelain. Around her gathered cadmen, rag-pickers, dock laborers, and the homeless soul, drawn by the warmth that rose from her steam. Her tea was weak, her bread stale, but her voice was soft, her stories rich. She told tales of summers past, of roses in the countryside, of her husband's laughter when life was easier. Men listened not for the words, but for the way her voice softened the world. When a child begged near her stall, she would slip him a biscuit and whisper, "Eat slow. Love it lasts longer that way." Those who passed by her corner often said that Eliza's tea didn't just warm the hands, it warmed the heart. Farther down the street, in a narrow passage between two tenements, another woman worked quietly. Her name was Nora Finch, known among locals as the night cook. She had once worked in the kitchen of a wealthy merchant, but was dismissed after stealing a crust of bread for her starving child. Now she cooked for those even poorer than herself. Her pot was enormous, dented, and always full of something bubbling stew, porridge, or broth, depending on what the day's scraps had offered. She cooked with a rhythm that felt like prayer, stirring, tasting, adding a pinch of salt, humming softly to herself. The glow from her fire painted her face gold, and the steam curled through her hair like smoke from an altar. Men who'd worked all day unloading ships would sit on the cold ground, slurping her stew in silence. She never asked for payment, only said, "Leave what you can." Sometimes she received a penny, sometimes a piece of coal, sometimes nothing, but always a thank you, and that was enough. The police often chased her away for blocking the public way, but she always returned the next night. To her, feeding others was not a job, it was resistance. "If we stop feeding," she told a constable once, "the city will starve itself from the inside out." In another part of the city, near Covent Gardens, abandoned arches, lived Mary Harker. Known for her penny pies, she baked them in an old tin oven she'd rescued from a junk dealer, filling them with whatever she could find: mashed potatoes, onions, even bruised apples from the market floor. By some miracle, her pies always sold out. The poor lined up for them, the smell drawing them like a promise. One night, a wealthy gentleman stopped by out of curiosity, drawn by the aroma. He asked what was inside, and Mary smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hope," she said, and handed him one for free. He left confused, but that word stayed with him. The next evening he returned not to buy, but to bring her a bag of flour. It was the first gift anyone had given her in years. That night Mary baked twice as many pies and gave half of them away to the children who played barefoot in the street. To her, kindness was currency, and it was never in short supply. These women were the heartbeat of a starving city. They stood in the cold, sleeves rolled, eyes watchful, turning scarcity into sustenance. The men might have ruled the factories and the markets, but it was the women who ruled the nights with their pots and their courage. They were mothers to strangers, saints without altars, cooks without kitchens. Their fires burned small, but their warmth spread far through alleys, through souls, through history itself. No newspaper ever wrote about them. No painter ever captured their faces. Yet without them, the poor of London would have gone cold and silent long before dawn. They didn't cook for fame or fortune. They cooked because someone had to. Because hunger was a darkness they refused to let win. When morning came, they packed their pots and vanished with the fog. The cobblestones where they'd stood were slick with dew. The fires cold, the air empty of the smells that had made the night bearable. But if one looked closely, they might see traces of few crumbs, a scrap of cloth, a broken spoon, signs that someone had cared. However quietly, the city would wake, stretch, and move on, unaware that its truest heroes were women who had spent the night feeding those who couldn't feed themselves. The world might have forgotten their names, but the warmth they left behind lingered, rising like smoke into the morning light. When London slept beneath its heavy blanket of soot and silence, another world woke in secret, the world of the midnight bakers. Hidden behind crumbling walls and half-shuttered shops, men and women rose long before dawn to knead dough by candlelight, their hands ghostly with flour, their hearts steady with hunger and hope. In the small hours when even the rats grew quiet, you could hear it, the rhythm of survival, the dull thud of dough against a wooden board, the soft hiss of ovens fed with scavenged coal, and the whisper of prayer that every loaf might rise. Bread in Victorian London was more than food. It was the difference between dignity and despair. The poor could live without meat, even without tybut. It was called the staff of life, and yet the hands that made it were often the hungriest of all. The bakers worked in cellars where the air hung thick with heat and smoke, where the windows were blackened to hide the glow from the watchful eyes of inspectors. Because the city's rules demanded licenses, fees, and taxes for every crumb, so they baked in the shadows, unseen and unpaid, turning flour and water into quiet rebellion. Among them was a man named Henry Cobb, once a journeyman baker, now an outlaw of sorts. He ran a tiny underground bakery beneath an abandoned tavern near His oven was built from old bricks, his tools were stolen, and his flour was bought in scraps from sympathetic millers. Each night, he and his 2 daughters would knead dough until their arms ached, shaping small round loaves they called ghost bread cheap, light, barely sweet, but enough to fill an empty stomach. By 4 in the morning, the air around the hidden bakery would grow heavy with the scent of baking warm, comforting, like a promise whispered to the poor. When the first carts rolled through the cobblestones above, Henry's daughters would wrap the loaves in scraps of cloth and slip them out to the women of the market, who sold them at dawn for a penny apiece. The police never found him. They said the smell of bread always vanished before sunrise. For Henry, baking wasn't just trade, it was defiance. "They can tax the rich," he once said, "but they can't tax the smell of bread." In another part of the city, behind the soot-black chimneys of Whitechapel, worked an old woman named Agatha, known among beggars as Mother Crust. Her bakery wasn't really a bakery at all. It was the remains of a bombed-out workshop she had turned into a small oven room. Every night she lit her fire with scraps of furniture, old posters, and anything that would burn. Her bread was rough and heavy, made from coarse flour and potato mash, but it had a sweetness that no one could explain. Some said it came from the sugar, she added. Others swore it came from her heart. Agatha baked, not for profit, but for memory. She'd lost her husband in a factory fire and her son to the workhouse. "The world took my family," she used to say, "but it won't take my kindness." Each loaf she baked carried a mark, a small cross pressed with her thumb. The poor who received her bread believed it was blessed, and perhaps it was, because no one ever fell ill from it, no matter how stale or cold. The constables often tried to evict her, but the neighbors always warned her in time. And every time she packed up her oven and moved to another corner of the city, the hungry found her again, as if guided by the smell of hope itself, down by the river docks, where the fog thickened into ghostly walls. Another kind of baker worked a man named Samuel Pike, a crippled sailor who had lost his leg in a storm at sea. With nowhere to go, he had built a small oven out of shipwrecked bricks and an iron pan, using it to bake flatbreads for dock workers returning from the night shift. His oven smoked badly, his loaves were uneven, but his laugh filled the air like a bell. The men called him Captain Bread, and in return he charged them only stories. "Tell me what the sea looks like tonight," he'd say, handing out a warm loaf. "Tell me how the tide sounds when the wind blows west." And they would, their voices rough but full of life. For those few moments, among the smell of salt, ash, and dough, the men remembered what it felt like to be human again. Samuel's bread was not just food, it was conversation, memory, and home. In the records of London's grand history, there is no mention of these bakers. The ledgers speak of kings, merchants, and magnates, but not of the men and women who worked by firelight to feed the invisible half of the city. Yet, if you walked through the narrow streets before sunrise, you might have seen the evidence: a faint orange glow behind a boarded window, a curl of smoke rising from a cellar, or a trail of footprints dusted with flour. These were the city's real miracles, the quiet labor that kept the poor alive when the world had forgotten them. They didn't wear halos or crowns. They wore aprons stiff with soot and fingers burned from ovens. And when dawn came, they melted away into the crowd, leaving behind only the smell of bread and the faint warmth of ovens cooling in the dark. By morning, as London's rich awoke to buttered toast and hot rolls, the midnight bakers had already gone to bed, exhausted, their work unseen, their hunger unspoken. But for a few hours each night, They turned poverty into poetry, turning flower into life, and silence into the sweetest kind of music. If you listen closely, even today, as the city hums and machines replace hands, you can almost hear them still, the quiet thud of dough, the whisper of rising loaves, and the sigh of those who baked for everyone but themselves. The midnight bakers of Victorian London may have lived in the shadows, but their warmth still lingers, baked forever into the city's soul. There are nights in every city when hunger forgets its shame and dares to dream. And in the smoky heart of Victorian London, one such night came each winter when the poor gathered to create something they called the poor man's banquet. It was not a feast of luxury, but a fragile theater of imagination, an evening where broken men, widowed women, and shoeless children pretended, just for a few hours, that they too belonged to the world of those who dined by candlelight and not by chance. On this particular December evening, the fog lay thick over Whitechapel, muffling the noise of carriage wheels and turning every lamp into a golden halo. Inside a cold alley behind a tavern called the Gilded Swan, a group of workers and their families huddled together in the remains of an abandoned warehouse, whose roof leaked like a sieve and whose floor smelled of wet wood and hope. They had gathered whatever scraps they could find: half a loaf from the bakery, a jug of watered ale, 2 turnips, a piece of salt pork, and a few cold potatoes that someone had rescued from the trash outside a gentleman's club. But tonight, it wasn't about what they ate. It was about pretending it was enough. A man named Thomas Rook, a lamplighter by trade and the unofficial host, stood at the center with a broken ladle like a scepter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said grandly, "welcome to the banquet of kings and fools." Laughter rippled through the group, not the laughter of wealth, but the kind that comes from defiance. They spread out their food on old newspapers, each pretending it was fine linen. Mary, a seamstress with trembling hands, tore the bread into pieces and said, "Tonight, this is not crusted's cake." A boy with soot on his face raised a cracked mug and shouted to the Queen, and everyone laughed again because the Queen would never know their names. They passed around a small jug of ale like a sacred relic, each taking a sip as though it were wine from heaven. The fire they built in a rusted barrel crackled weakly, casting flickering light on faces worn thin by life. Someone had found a cracked mirror and hung it on the wall, and in its reflection they could almost see themselves differently, not as beggars, but as guests. The children were the first to forget the cold. They danced around the fire, their laughter echoing off the stone walls like the sound of bells. One of them, little Ada, had tied ribbons of newspaper around her hair, and she twirled like a ballerina, her bare feet black with soot but her smile brighter than any chandelier. An old man named Frederick, once a music teacher before drink and debt had claimed his life, pulled out a harmonica and began to play. The tune was shaky, but sweet, the kind that carried warmth into bones, even when the air was freezing. Couples swayed slowly, not from love perhaps, but from the shared ache of survival. A woman clapped her hands and sang a song about the River Thames. Her voice cracked but pure, and for a moment, the warehouse didn't feel like ruin, it felt like home. The banquet continued with its mock pageantry. Thomas announced the first course, potato peel soup. It was nothing more than boiled water, with a few scraps floating inside. But they served it with ceremony, pouring it into tin cups as though they were fine china. Everyone clapped when the main course arrived. One small piece of pork that was sliced into paper-thin portions so everyone might taste it. Each bite was chewed slowly, reverently, as though it were divine. And when they reached the end of the meal, Mary stood and unveiled the dessert, a crust of bread sprinkled with sugar, dusted from the bottom of an empty sack. The crowd applauded, children squealed, and for that brief, shimmering moment, the hunger faded. They weren't poor anymore. They were people again, full of life, laughter, and imagination. Outside, the snow began to fall in soft flakes that melted as soon as they touched the cobblestones. The sound of carriages faded into the distance, replaced by the low hum of the city breathing in its sleep. Thomas stepped outside for a moment, his breath clouding in the icy air. He looked up at the sky, where the moon hung pale and ghost-like above the rooftops. And he smiled, not because life was good, but because it still was. When he returned, he carried with him a secret prize, a small bag of apples he had found discarded by a grocer, who thought them too bruised to sell. He placed them on the table like treasure. The group gasped, and the children's eyes went wide. He handed one to each person, saying, "For dessert, fresh from the orchards of heaven." They bit into the fruit, the taste sweet and sharp against their tongues. And for many, it was the first fresh apple they'd had all year. Tears mixed with laughter, and even Frederick, the old musician, said softly, This is what life should taste like." As the night deepened, the fire burned low, but no one wanted to leave. They told stories of old battles, of lost loves, of dreams that hadn't died yet. They spoke of ships sailing to America, of inventions that might change the world, of a future where children would never go hungry again. The air grew thick with words, smoke, and memory. Someone began humming a lullaby, and the group slowly grew quiet, their bodies huddled close for warmth. The snow outside thickened, soft and endless, blanketing the city that would never know this small miracle. The warehouse glowed faintly from within, like a lantern in the dark, and if anyone had walked by, they might have thought they saw ghost shadows of people laughing, eating, living, loving. But these weren't ghosts. They were the beating heart of London, alive despite everything, stubbornly, beautifully alive. When morning came, the fog lifted, and the city woke to another day of work and want. The banquet was gone. The floor was swept clean. The fire was ashes. The apples just cores. But something lingered in invisible warmth, a trace of laughter that even the cold couldn't erase. For those who had been there, that one night would last forever, a night when the poorest of the poor became kings, queens, and dreamers, seated at the grandest table of all, the table of survival. And though their names were never written in history books, if you listen closely on a winter's night, when the wind blows through the alleys of London, you can still hear their voices softly saying grace for the little they had and the much they imagined. London awoke that morning not to birdsong but to footsteps, thousands of them, heavy, tired, and full of fury as the fog rolled low across the Thames. A river of humanity began to move through the city's veins, men and women whose stomachs had long since forgotten what fullness felt like, whose eyes carried that hollow shine that only hunger can carve into the soul. They called it the Hunger March, but to those walking, it was something far deeper. It was a final prayer in motion. They came from every direction, from the soot-choked factories of the East End, from the docks where work had dried up, from the villages where crops had failed and landlords had taken everything but the will to keep walking. The sound was strange at first, a dull murmur, the slow rhythm of worn boots striking cobblestones. But as they gathered, hundreds turning to thousands, the noise swelled into a kind of heartbeat that the city couldn't ignore. Old men leaned on sticks, mothers carried babies wrapped in rags, and boys barely 12 held homemade signs that read, "We hunger not for charity, but for bread." The cold air burned their lungs, but they kept walking, their breath rising like steam, their silence louder than any anthem. The shopkeepers watched from behind their windows, clutching ledgers and fear. The constables stood ready at corners, their polished buttons gleaming like the eyes of a system that had long since stopped seeing. At the head of the march walked a man named Elijah Gray, a coal miner turned laborer turned leader by the simple fact that he refused to bow. His coat was torn, his boots full of holes, but his back was straight. Every step he took was for his dead wife, who had starved the winter before. Every word he shouted was for his 2 daughters, still sleeping under a blanket of newspaper miles away. "We are not beasts," he cried, his voice cutting through the fog. "We ask not for pity, but for justice." His words rolled down the streets, bounced off brick walls, and echoed through the alleys where children played among ash heaps. Behind him, the crowd answered, not with words, but with footsteps, steady, endless drumbeat of defiance. They marched past the bakeries, where the smell of bread drifted like a cruel taunt, past the pubs, where laughter spilled out warm and thick as stew, past the mansions, whose windows glowed gold against the gray sky. Some threw glances of disgust, others of guilt, but no one could look away for long. The statues of generals loomed above them, cold and indifferent, as though carved from the very stone of apathy. The crowd spread wide, filling every corner of the square, a sea of caps, shawls, and hungry faces. A woman named Nora Bell climbed onto a crate, her baby tied to her chest, and began to speak not like a politician, but like a mother whose patience had finally burned out. "They tell us to be grateful," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Grateful for crumbs, for soup lines, for prayers that never reach heaven. But what does gratitude mean to an empty stomach?" The crowd roared in agreement, the sound raw and terrible, like thunder made of pain. The police shifted uneasily, their batons glinting in the pale light. A constable called out for calm, but no one listened anymore. The world had been calm for too long. A young boy climbed a lamppost and waved a scrap of cloth like a flagot. Wasn't red or white or blue, just a torn piece of sack, but it fluttered like fire. Someone began to sing a hymn first, then a song of protest. It spread quickly, voices joining one by one, until it seemed the city itself was singing. And then, as if the heavens themselves were watching, snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting down onto the sea of faces. It was beautiful and cruel at once, the kind of snow that makes everything look peaceful even when nothing is. The crowd lifted their eyes to the sky, letting the flakes melt on their tongues, as though tasting purity in a world gone sour. Elijah stood still, snow collecting on his shoulders, and whispered, "Maybe God finally sees us." But the peace didn't last. A stone flew from the edge of the crowd. No one knew who threw it, but it struck the base of a statue, shattering silence into chaos. The police surged forward, shouting, truncheons raised. The marchers didn't fight. Most just stood, stunned, as blows fell on shoulders and heads. A few cried out, not in rage, but in disbelief. The hymn broke apart, replaced by screams, the sound of boots against flesh, the crash of tin cups spilling onto the cobblestones. Elijah tried to raise his voice again, but someone struck him down, and the world went white. When the snow cleared and the fog drifted back, the square was empty again, except for a few broken signs, a lost shoe, and a pool of melted ice where the fire of hope had burned too briefly. The newspapers the next day called it a disturbance by the indigent, and the politicians called it a necessary restoration of order. But in the slums, in the alleys, in the silent hearts of those who had walked, the march did not die. It lived on in whispers. They heard us, if only for a moment. The next winter, another march rose, smaller but fiercer, then another and another, until the echo of that first day became legend. For, in the end, hunger is the oldest teacher, and those who listen to its voice do not forget its lessons. Elijah Gray never marched. Again he lay buried in a pauper's grave on the city's edge. But the song they sang that day still rose from the streets, like smoke whenever injustice walked too proudly. If you wander Trafalgar Square on a cold morning, before the buses roar and the pigeons scatter, you might still feel, if the faint tremor underfoot, the heartbeat of thousands who marched not for bread alone, but for dignity. The city has grown rich since then, its windows brighter, its streets cleaner, but somewhere beneath the stone and steel, their footsteps remain, echoing through time. They were poor, but they were loud. They were hungry, but they were unbroken. And in their hunger, they found something greater than food. They found each other. The winter of 1888 was the kind that seemed to last forever. A season so cold it felt like the sky itself had frozen in sorrow. And in the heart of London's East End, where fog and hunger lived as neighbors, a group of men and women gathered for what they would later call, without irony, the Last Supper of the Poor. It wasn't a planned event, not a rebellion, not even a prayer. It began simply because one woman, Martha Finch, had found half a sack of flour discarded behind a mill and refused to eat it alone. Her husband had died that year of consumption, her 2 sons gone to the workhouse, and her only remaining family was the street itself. She lit a fire beneath the arch of an old bridge by the Thames, the river black and silent beside her, and began to mix the flour with melted snow in a cracked bowl. The sound drew others, the invisible ones, who wandered through the night like ghosts. One by one they came, an old shoemaker whose shop had burned down, a child with no name who slept beside chimneys, a woman who once sang in taverns but now could barely hum. They gathered not for food, but for warmth, for the fragile comfort of other beating hearts in the dark. Martha looked at them and said softly, "If we eat together, maybe we remember we're still alive." And so they began. The fire burned low and steady, its glow painting their faces in gold and shadow. The river's breath rose in misty clouds, wrapping them like a shroud. Martha poured the thin batter onto a piece of tin and held it over the fire, and the smell of cooking bread, a smell so simple, so wholly, spread into the air like a memory of better days. When the first flat cake was ready, she broke it into pieces and passed it around. No one spoke at first. They chewed, slowly, reverently, each bite a small miracle. For some, it was the first real food they'd had in days. The shoemaker closed his eyes and whispered, "This tastes like home." The child smiled faintly and said, "I can feel it warming me from the inside." Around them, the city groaned, carriages rumbling over bridges, distant bells tolling midnight, the endless whisper of water moving under the ice, but beneath the bridge, time itself seemed to stop. For once, the cold did not win. A man named Walter, once a clerk, began to tell a story. His voice was weak but steady as he spoke of the time he had seen the Queen herself pass by in her carriage, her face pale and beautiful behind glass. "She looked right through me," he said, "but tonight I think she'd see us." They laughed not bitterly, but softly, like tired people remembering how to smile. Martha cooked another cake, then another, until the flour was gone. When she looked at the last one, she hesitated, then tore it into equal parts and handed the largest piece to the child. "The young should eat first," she said. The boy shook his head and offered it back, but she pressed it into his hand. "No," she said, "you'll see the morning. That's worth feeding." The others nodded. It was an unspoken rule among the poor: the living must go on, even when the living hurts. They sat there long after the fire began to fade, talking about everything and nothing. One woman spoke of the countryside she'd left behind, green fields and apple trees that now seemed like dreams. Another hummed a lullaby that her mother had sung when bread was still plenty and nights were warm. Walter recited a few lines from a poem he remembered from school, something about stars and gray sand. For a brief, impossible moment, it felt as if the world above had stopped spinning just to listen. Snow began to fall again, slow and soundless, each flake glowing as it drifted through the firelight. It landed on Martha's hair, on the child's shoulders, on the hands of those who had nothing left to give. They watched it fall, none of them speaking, all of them breathing in sync. When the last ember died, the darkness returned, soft but heavy. Martha leaned back against the cold stone, her eyes closing. The others followed, curling close like a family long lost and now found again. One by one, their breathing slowed. The river murmured beside them, carrying secrets to the sea. In the morning, a constable found them silent, still, the fire long dead, but the smell of baked bread still lingering in the air. He stood there for a while, hat in hand, not knowing what to do. They hadn't stolen, hadn't begged, hadn't caused trouble. They had simply shared what little the world had left them. Someone from the parish came to take their bodies away, and for once, even the city seemed to bow its head. The papers didn't print their names. The workhouses didn't claim them. But in the weeks that followed, something strange began to happen. Bakers in Whitechapel started leaving loaves by the river each night. Dock workers began sharing their lunch with beggars. And one cold morning, someone found a small wooden sign nailed under that same bridge. It read, in uneven letters, "Here the poor ate together," and it was enough. The sign stayed for years, weathered and worn, until the river finally swallowed it. But some nights, when the fog is thick and the moon low, those who walk the embankment say they can still smell bread baking faintly in the air, and if they listen close enough, they can almost hear laughter carried on the wind-soft, tired, but full of peace. The Last Supper of the poor wasn't a tragedy. It was a prayer answered in its own way, for in that single meal, They had conquered what even the richest could not. They had turned hunger into grace, and death into communion. Their story was never written, yet it lives on in the quiet acts of kindness that still happen in dark corners, in every piece of bread broken by one human being for another. And though their faces have long since vanished into history's shadow, the warmth of that night of firelight reflected in hungry eyes burns on eternal, invisible, unforgettable